Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to all, whatever time you might be watching this recording. We are so happy to have you with us for this next installment in our tech study companion to the JCRC speaker series. My name is Ross Levy. I am currently the Foundation Fellow, the Rabbinic Intern with the Cincinnati JCRC, and I am your host for these tech studies where we'll be highlighting different community leaders and bringing in some voices from our Jewish tradition to bear on modern times. As a quick reminder, the Jewish Community Relations Council is examining the current crisis in America through its speaker series, To Bigotry, No Sanction: Jewish Perspectives at the Crossroads of American Democracy and Pathways Forward. Each program will unpack a different aspect of the changing dynamics in our democracy, with a focus on what we as citizens can do to strengthen it. This particular speaker event features Cincinnati's own Rana Greff Schneider, who will be discussing the changing dynamics of the Supreme Court with a specific focus on free speech and the interaction between civil and religious liberties. Today, I am honored and excited to be joined by Rabbi Ben Chadel. Rabbi Chadel is the associate rabbi at Adath Israel, originally from the Bronx, New York, correct? He studied religious studies at Yale University and earned rabbinic ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Rabbi Chadel traveled to Jewish communities across the South as an education fellow with the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. And he is currently the secretary of the Greater Cincinnati Board of Rabbis and is also active in the interfaith community groups such as the AGAC and Interfaith Hospitality Network. Welcome, Rabbi Chadel. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's such an honor. I'm so glad to be here with you and with everyone who's watching us today.
So just to give a little bit of framing of what we'll be doing today, something that you and I talked about in planning for this is how both American and Jewish culture deeply value freedom of speech and expression. On the one hand, we have the First Amendment, the right to free speech, and also how important that is for the Jewish community in giving us the opportunity to advocate for ourselves politically. And on the Jewish side of things, we've always valued a free exchange of ideas and this notion of machloket, of debate and disagreement, and that it's not a bad thing, that many machlokot, many disagreements are l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And something that we're going to be exploring today, and it's specifically looking at rabbinic literature in terms of the Babylonian Talmud, is while we value free speech, we value this disagreement, are there any limits? Are there certain elements of free speech that should be curtailed? Because we also recognize in Jewish tradition how powerful and potentially dangerous speech can be. So with that, we'll direct you to our text sheet, which you can find on the website. So please follow along with us. And as we move along, we'll look at a few different texts. We'll have some guiding questions, and we hope that this serves as a study and a conversation starter for you all watching at home. So Rabbi Chadel, would you like to kick us off?
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ross, for that wonderful introduction of framing our discussion about what are the limits on the free speech that we so value, but when can speech be dangerous, right? Like we know from Justice Brandeis, the famous ruling in the Supreme Court, right? That we have the right to free speech, but not to shout fire in a crowded theater, right? Sometimes speech can lead to damage. It can lead to hurting other people, right? And that's the kind of speech that we'll be talking about. And that's the kind of speech that's found in our first source from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Bava Metzia. We read in this very short source, you can follow along in the handout, but I'll read it aloud as well. Whoever shames their neighbor in public, it is as if they shed their blood. What is the source saying? It's saying that publicly shaming another person, causing embarrassment, causing literally their blood to fall away from their face, their life force to fall away as they're pale, right? That's as if you're murdering them, you're shedding blood. And this is not just, a hyperbole or a teaching. This is a Jewish legal document, right? This has a lot of ramifications for how we are to act. And it's saying it's as if you're murdering another person to publicly shame them, right? Imagine how different our society, our media, our social media might be if we took this into account. And some of the questions that I have when I read this source is why? Why is public shaming given such a weight here? Why is it considered to be like murder? And I'd love to sort of pose that to Ross. Why do you think it's taken so seriously here? Why not just say, oh, don't do it? But why is it saying why is it like murder?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I really loved your interpretation of sort of shedding blood and relating that to the idea of like blood either leaving their face or flushing their face in humiliation. And, I think a large part of this is how much of people's livelihoods in a very sort of literal, tangible sense relies upon their reputation, relies upon their standing within the community in terms of how, with whom they're able to do business deals, sending kids to schools. And of course, if we think about sort of the original context that this was written, it's not quite like, oh, you could go to the shul down the street and things would be okay. Everyone's living within a much more sort of tight-knit community. And it also speaks to how damaging in the really tangible sense to people's lives that words and in public humiliation and shaming can be.
Yeah, in a society where your standing in the community really is what sustains you, right? Then being cut off from that community is really serious, right? And I think that there's such a connection between our lives and the communities and the social connections that we have. We're going to see that theme sort of coming out through our sources. So yeah, thank you so much. What I'd like to sort of take from this is that for the rabbis, right, speech, as Ross, as you so beautifully said, speech has this tremendous power, both to heal and to bring life to the world, but also to cause damage, right? And because of the damage that speech can cause, there is this sense that we're not totally free to say whatever we want at all times, right? There are sometimes limits on what we're going to say. And our one of our topics for today is what are those limits and how do we lead our society to a place where speech is used for constructive purposes and not for destructive purposes. And one of the ways that the rabbis try to teach this is through these teachings in the Talmud. So I'd like to share a second one. This is from the tractate Arachin 15b. And I'll read the source. It goes as follows. Speaking badly about a third person kills 3 people. The one who tells it, the one who accepts it, and the one spoken about. And in here we're referring to what is known in Hebrew as Lashon Hara, which is literally negative speech or malicious speech. It's defined legally actually as speaking negative truths about another person. It's not even spreading lies, but it's actually saying negative truths, but in a way that is malicious, in a way that's trying to speak really to hurt the other person. We're not talking about if someone asks you for a recommendation and you say, an honest assessment of their character. We're talking about gossip, right? We're talking about not constructive speech. And in this case too, this speech is considered to be a form of killing, a form of murder. But I think what's so interesting about this source is that it not only is a way of killing or destroying the person who's spoken about, right, the victim, like if someone is speaking about Sally, right? Oh, Sally, she has such a bad mouth. It's not just hurting Sally. It's also hurting me who's saying this about Sally. And it's also hurting Ross who's listening to me, right? It's as if we're killing all of us. And that's sort of another question that I have is why does the text emphasize this as well? Why doesn't it just hurt the person who we're speaking about? Why is it hurting all of the speaker and the listener as well? Ross, if you have any thoughts on that, then I'll share.
Yeah, sure. I'm also curious to hear your thoughts. I think it, because of how damaging it can be, to hold your emotions in that, or express your emotions in that sort of a way. Meaning the idea is, okay, if you feel a certain way about someone, or someone does something that is harmful or damaging to you, one reaction I think we as human beings, as imperfect human beings, is, talk to your neighbor and talk about how terrible that person is. But on the one hand, we could think about it in terms of the sort of tangible, logical reputation element, in the sense of, if people know you as someone who is constantly speaking like this about someone, maybe you sort of lose some respect and repute in their eyes, or repute. And I think at the same time, it can be really damaging to people's souls, to people's spirits, to constantly to use this as sort of a way of building relationships with other people by only putting down, the third party. And so I think, and those who accept it and sort of instigate it, I think sort of the implication behind accept is enable it, to use our modern terminology. It can be just as damaging, and it creates this sort of toxic environment where that type of behavior is allowed, and also and not, and allowed to sort of take root and sort of poison the roots of societal framework. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think to jump off of what you just said, I think that's, for me, that's really the key point here, is that speaking negatively about others just phrase the social networks that are so important. We spoke earlier how important it is to our very lives and livelihoods to be part of a community, right? And speaking badly about others prevents us from doing so, right? It prevents us from trusting other people. We're going to see a source a little bit later that speaks more about that. But it prevents our society really to function. When you hear something badly, when you hear something bad about someone that you don't really need to hear, it prevents you from forming a real genuine relationship with them. I think another point related to this, why it's so damaging, not only to the victim, but also to the person speaking and the person listening, is that it enables, and I love that term used for the person listening, it's an enabler. It enables us a practice of scapegoating, right? When you look at people who spew hate speech in our society today, when you look in the past at examples of societies filled with hate, such as Nazi Germany, right? All of these perpetrators of hate have used it as a way to scapegoat others for issues in their own society that they need to address, right? And we saw the incredibly tragic consequences of this in Nazi Germany, of course, for the Jewish community, and of course, for all the victims of the Nazis, but also for the German people themselves, right? Their country really didn't benefit much from all the hate that they espoused. So it really diverts us from taking positive construction action to better our own lives when we're scapegoating others, right? In the sense that it does sort of kill our life force and the person we're saying it to. So we've spoken a bit about Lashon Hara, speaking negative speech, and I want to bring the comparison to hate speech, right? Because on the one hand, I think when you're sharing hate speech about another group, when people speak in anti-Semitic stereotypes and say, look at the Jewish bankers who are controlling finances, right? They're speaking badly about Jews, but it's also important to consider how that kind of speech actually is damaging the people who are saying that speech and who are also listening to it, how it erodes the bonds of trust within society that we really need between different groups. And that, I think for that reason, it's so important and so relevant, the topic under discussion by Dr. Schneider, right? The question of limits to free speech with regard to hate speech. And, of course, hate speech is like Lashon Hara in that it's speaking maliciously. I think one important difference is that hate speech is not true, right? Lashon Hara is often true statements. Hate speech is more libelous statements. It's statements that are false, lies about another group. And the question, of course, is sort of talking about these consequences of hate speech, is how to respond to it, right? And different countries in the world have different ways to respond. Some countries, for example, in Germany, right, post-Holocaust, have made hate speech much more censored, right? They've made it illegal by statute to say certain things about other groups. Right? In America, with our commitment to free speech, we often take a different approach, but there are certainly laws, hate crime laws that offer greater punishments after committing crimes motivated by hate. And the sources that we're going to be looking at now, this is from the Tractate Psachim, has to do with how we respond to Lashon Hara. And as I read it, I want us to also think about how we respond to hate speech in our society. So I'll go ahead and read this the statement from the Tractate Psachim in the Babylonian Talmud. Rav Sheshet said in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, anyone who speaks Lashon Hara and anyone who accepts, i.e. believes Lashon Hara, and anyone who gives false testimony about another, it is fitting to throw them to the dogs. Throw them to the dogs. What does that mean?
That's powerful words.
Those are serious words, right? Yeah. It's fitting to throw them to the dogs. I think a question to consider here is also how literal this is. Is it saying literally throw them to the dogs? Is that a form of punishment they had? Or is this more like a statement about someone's character? Like that kind of person is so despicable, right? That throw them to the dogs. Right, and it's interesting to consider what is that in itself a form of a kind of consequence. Is that shaming someone, to speak to our earlier source? And I want us to spark for us when we hear someone speaking Lashon Hara, when we hear someone needlessly gossiping, right? When we hear someone speaking a stereotype about another group, whether it's true or not, right? What should the consequences be for that person? Right? Do we think they're fit to throw them to the dogs? Right? Are there should there be consequences? And what is the best way to prevent this kind of speech in the future? So I know I'm putting a lot out there. I'm going to process some thoughts and then I'll jump back in.
Yeah, definitely. And just to respond really quickly to that, and I realize for those following along, we have a lot of texts and a lot of questions. We don't have all the time in the world, although I think we could sit here and discuss this for hours on end. One thing I did want to mention is, on the one hand, there are punishments that might work, but I think one of the approaches for the JCRC and other community organizations that seek to lead through education and dialogue is to have those encounters and those dialogues with people who might be doing that, and not say necessarily, oh, you believe that thing or you said that thing, we don't want to have anything to do with you, but saying the reason why you said that thing is because of ignorance, or because your worldview might be a little bit confined to your own life experience. And so we're very much committed to that, and that's a really big part of our work. But continuing on with our texts, I also wanted to bring, so we have Lashon Hara, this idea of malicious speech or malicious gossip. And there's also an obligation from our Jewish sources not to publicly humiliate people, and seeing that as a form of death. But to sort of counterbalance that, and maybe even to complicate things a little bit, I wanted to bring in a source that talks about, the Hebrew term is tochacha, being rebuke. Times when we really call people out for things that they've said, damaging actions that they've made, and doing so oftentimes in a very public way, as a way of holding people accountable. And so, that boundary between rebuking people versus publicly shaming them to the point where it destroys their lives can be a difficult tightrope to walk. I don't want to go through this whole, I'll include some snippets, but a little bit later in Tractate Arachin, which we read from earlier, we hear this common question, where do we learn? From where do we derive that a person who sees something unseemly in their fellow is obligated to rebuke them? And to this, the Talmud responds, citing Leviticus 19:17, you shall surely rebuke. If the person rebukes their friend, but their friend does not accept the rebuke, meaning they do not change their ways or are unwilling to hear what they're saying, where do we learn that the person should rebuke them again? And again, citing the same verse, it says, you shall surely rebuke. And what it's pointing to is in the Hebrew, you have the same root being used twice, which in biblical Hebrew is really a sign of emphasis. And one might ask, even if their face changes, even as you were talking about earlier, the blood leaving their face to the point of humiliation, which we want to guard against, is it okay to continue to rebuke them even though they're humiliated? And the text seems to say yes, because and that's why in Leviticus it is written, you will not bear sin because of them, meaning the sin that you might incur by pushing this person to the point of humiliation, you're okay because you're issuing a form of rebuke. And this sort of complicates things because on the one hand, we don't want to destroy people's lives. And on the other hand, we need to call people out that are spreading, whether it's malicious truths or in the case of anti-Semitic tropes, false narratives, libel, false accusations, things like that. And I think it also, this whole conversation of tochacha and rebuke also opens up what it means to hear criticism. It's one thing to talk about it from the perspective of those of us who feel that we're being attacked by certain forms of rhetoric. But I think also it's important to recognize from the other side that we might say things, or we might have a part of our rhetoric that needs to be sort of called into question. And so for that reason, I just wanted to bring in the last paragraph of source number 4, this story cited in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And he describes a story where Akiva was punished many times on his account because of his rebuke, as I would complain about him before Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel the Great. And all the more so, each time that I rebuked him, him being Akiva, it increased his love for me. This incident serves to affirm that which is stated, do not rebuke a scorner lest he hate you, rebuke a wise man and he will love you. And so what we learn from this is that a wise person wants to improve themselves and loves those who assist them in that task. And so this is like a nice story about Akiva in the sense that in a certain sense, he was punished or damaged by these rebukes of him. But at the same time, he was wise enough to understand that they were coming from a place of love and from a place of wanting everyone to be able to hold each other accountable so that we as a society can continue to hold ourselves to standards and use language as a constructive rather destructive means. I just talked for a while. Curious to hear your thoughts, Rabbi Chadel.
Yeah, I love that last note that you said about how language really is what bonds us as a society, right? It's what enables trust and cooperation, right? And that sense of being open to hearing feedback from others is a really big way we can do that, right? It's how we grow as individuals. It's also how we grow in relationship with others and learn how we can better connect with other people. And I think that's part of the reason why Rabbi Akiva is one of the greatest rabbis that we have, because he had such love, not only for his neighbor or his friends, but even for people who criticized him, because he knew that would enable him to be a better person, a better Jew, and just a better human being. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's also one of the best responses to the temptation to gossip, to engage in Lashon Hara, right? If something's bothering, like Ross, if I'm bothered by, I just hate your yarmulke, I hate how you wear it. It's so, if that really bothers me, right? Better to just tell it to you if I think there's something wrong with your yarmulke, as opposed to go, oh, hey, look at Ross, look how he wears his yarmulke, that wouldn't serve any constructive end, right? So the mitzvah of tochacha actually is a way of preventing Lashon Hara. It's a way of preventing gossiping, because you can get what's bothering you off of your chest. You can confront others with it in a constructive way, right? And that helps build, again, better connections between people.
Absolutely.
But of course, right, we're we're left with the question though, right? To circle back as we're coming close to our time about right free speech and limits to free speech. And I wanted to just to respond briefly to Ross, to your really important points earlier in the source about what happens when people do things that actually deserve rebuke. Right? What happens when confronting them isn't enough about it? Engaging in a conversation, as you said, JCRC so much values that sense of dialogue and engaging people in education, and that's so important, right? But are there times when we actually need to do more? When we need to assert ourselves a little more forcefully in terms of shutting down speech that might really lead to injury, violence, even death against other people, right? And that's sort of where I wanted to bring in a final source. This actually ties into the Torah portion that we just read this last Shabbat, Tazria Metzora. It's a really interesting source, and I'll sort of summarize very quickly the teachings in the Torah. But our Torah actually describes this mysterious ailment. It's a mysterious ailment because it doesn't only occur on people; it also afflicts clothing and houses and walls and plaster. It's a mysterious sort of white, scaly substance, right, that appears on your skin, and it could appear on your clothing and could appear again on the walls of your house. And the rabbis are perplexed by this. What does this mean? What led someone to develop this mysterious ailment? It's called tzara, to have this white scales that almost resemble like speaking of life and death, like the skin of a corpse. What leads it to occur? And the rabbis suggest that what led it to occur, what led this disease of tzara'at, what led someone to become mitzora, is motzi shem ra, which in Hebrew means bringing out a bad name, i.e. gossip. Right? Gossip is creating this mysterious ailment. And Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his wonderful Torah commentary, suggests that the reason for this is that tzara'at, this mysterious, very public affliction that occurs on your skin, that occurs on the walls of your house and on your clothing, this is actually an act of public rebuke by God. This is God telling this person in full view of others, you are doing something wrong. You are doing something that is destructive to the society and the community in which you live, right? And this is actually significant because this is one of the very few instances, as we said earlier, we want to avoid at all costs publicly embarrassing and shaming people. We never want to do this. But in this case, God is doing it. Why? Because Lashon Hara is so destructive, because speaking badly about others frays those fabrics of society, as Ross, you were saying, right? Anthropologists actually have argued, I'm quoting Rabbi Jonathan Sachs here, that language evolved precisely to strengthen the social bonds between us, to enable us to cooperate, right? And that's why it's so important to give good speech. And when we are not speaking well about others, when we're using speech that's hateful, right? Perhaps even to apply it in our discussion today, when people are engaging in hate speech that vilifies another group that could lead to violence against that group, perhaps a public rebuke is justified, right? As the text in Archim said, perhaps it actually is worth it to even embarrass the person doing it so that they won't do it again, right? And it's a very fine line. But I think that this discussion, and we're so grateful, Dr. Schneider, for bringing it, is to understand in the American legal context, what are the limits of speech and how do we limit that speech so that we can build the best possible society, so that we can constructively trust one another, right? And think about when I'm interacting with a Jewish person or a Chinese person, that they're someone I can trust, they're someone I can do business with. And really, it's that positive sense of building a cooperative society that underlies so much of this discussion about the limits of free speech.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a really fitting note to end on. And I hope that for those who have joined us, that this conversation has been a productive and society building use of words and conversation. It was such an honor and a pleasure for me. So thank you so much, Rabbi Chadel. Despite what you said about my yarmulke, I will let it go. I will forgive you for it. But once again, thank you on behalf of the JCRC. And thank you all for joining us wherever you may be. Enjoy the text study, enjoy the conversations that are spawned from it, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you all.
All right, take care, everyone.
Okay.